So, so first, I'm great honor to be invited to present in Protolang, and thanks invitation from Luke. I attended the very first Protolang 12 years ago, and now after 12 years, I'm here again. So I'm still recovering from a cold given by my daughter before I came here. So forgive my strong nasalizations sometimes. Okay. Okay, in this presentation, I will report agent-based modeling, studying the importance of perceptual constraints on colors, which can induce the universality of linguistic color categorization. So here's the outline. First, I will briefly introduce the word color survey datasets and the relevant theories about the origin of linguistic universality in color categorization. And then I'll briefly introduce the model, and then show the results, give you discussions and the conclusions. So back in 1970s, Professor Paul Kay from UC Berkeley and colleagues initiated this word color survey project. So they gradually documented the major basic color categories and the major color terms from 110 non-industrialized unwritten languages. So for each language, about 24 native speakers were asked to name each of these Mansell color chips in their own language, and then also pick, for each color term, pick the best representative color chip from this system as the kind of focal color for that particular color categories. This is the distribution about 110 languages in the worldwide, sampled in the word color survey. And in addition to black and white basic categories, you see that some languages have 2 colorful categories, some have 3, 4, 5, or 6. But relatively speaking, the basic color categories of a language, the number is very small. Well, this kind of a survey is not limited to non-industrialized languages. You can also do the similar thing for some of the industrialized languages like English. And Kay and colleagues conduct a statistical analysis. They're grouping all the 110 languages from word color survey, and then draw a contour plot, show the proportions for different color stimuli to be the focal colors across the 110 languages. And in this contour plot, you will see that these focal colors tend to cluster around certain regions, which largely match the focal colors of the English language. So according to that, Kay and our colleagues proposed that there seems to be a kind of a color categorization universal. There exists a relatively small number of universal focal colors based on which different languages build up their basic color categories to distinguish a large amount of color stimuli perceivable to human eyes. So this is their kind of a universal feature in color categorization across languages. Then after they proposed this kind of a theory, they proposed the kind of observations, there's some kind of a theoretical discussions about what factors trigger or induce this kind of a universality. So some scholars, including Kay, propose that it's the perceptual constraints of human eyes towards colors that induce this universality. But other scholars argue that socio-cultural transmissions may help to shape different boundaries of the color categories across languages. But so far, many of the existing studies in this line either fail to directly adjust the perceptual constraints so that to see whether a change of this constraints can induce different kind of color categories. Or many of the studies, including some of the modeling studies, are based on kind of a non-exhaustive or biased stimuli. Some experimental studies only use the color stimuli from the confusing regions between languages and examine whether perceptual constraints or other factors can affect discrimination on those kind of confusing stimuli. So in our study, we based on agent-based model. This is our proposal. So we'll use kind of a relatively complete set of color stimuli, and then use the agent-based model, which allows us to manipulate this real color stimuli in order to manipulate the perceptual constraints. We also implement the socio-cultural transmissions. In this kind of a model, we will see which factor, perceptual constraints or socio-cultural transmission, play the more important role in shaping the universality of color categorization. So let's go over the model. So first, instead of the Mansell chips, which only contain 330 color stimuli, we adopted a kind of a rich set of color stimuli from a psychophysics study, which examines the human eye's perception of different colors. You can download this data sets from this website. This 2,734 color stimuli distributed in this CIE-LAB space like this. CIE-LAB space is arguably the best representation of color stimulus which can better reflect the perceptual distance between different color stimuli. So in psychophysics, people usually represent colors in the CIE-LAB space instead of the Mansell chips. And we noticed that this 330 Mansell chips is actually a subset of this rich data sets. And then in order to manipulate the human perceptual constraints on colors, we actually conduct a randomization of this real color stimuli and create a randomized color stimuli with the same number of color stimuli, but all these stimuli are rotated randomly along the L-axis, a random angle. So in this way, although this randomization didn't greatly change the distribution in the A and B axis, the relative distance between each pair of color stimuli is distorted, so that we actually destroy the human perceptual constraints towards colors. So we will use these two sets of color stimuli to reflect two types of human perceptual constraints on colors. And then this is the basic framework of the model. So we will let two groups of agents, each using this real color stimuli, so reflecting the human perceptual constraints. And the other groups use this randomized color stimuli. And then they play this category game to develop their own linguistic categories, color categories and color terms. And then we gather a number of such kind of languages. And then we try to compare the emergent color categories between these two worlds with the empirical data from World Color Survey. So here's a brief introduction. So each word contains a number of populations. Each population develops a language. So since WCS use 110 languages, we have 110 sets. So in each population, two agents are randomly chosen to play this category game and gradually develop from scratch no category to some kind of a perceptual categories. And then we'll compare the emergent language with the other sets of the simulation results and the WCS empirical data. So here's a brief illustration of what happened during the category game. The whole idea is very similar to the category game developed by Andrea Baron-Kelly, Andrea Pugliese, and Victoria Loreto when I was a postdoc in Sapienza University of Rome, which is also similar to Luke's model. The details maybe it's much simple. So each game concerns a speaker agent and a hearer agent. Each game, two of the stimuli are randomly chosen from the color space. One is the topic. So each agent may have their own way of representing that the topic. For example, in this case, B and C actually fall into the same category of the speaker. So the speaker needs to do something to develop some category. So in this case, the speaker will segment, create new categories to associate respectively B and C, and invent some new words to represent that stimulus. And then send the newly created word, say brown, to represent the B, and send this word to the hearer. For hearer, it never heard of this word, so it's a failed game. In this case, the hearer will also learn this word and put that word into the inventory of the category that can associate the topic of that game. So a failed game triggers some development of category for both the speaker and the hearer. In another case, the same agent, a speaker and hearer agent, another two stimuli. This one is topic. For the speaker, this topic actually falls into this category, and the speaker will randomly select one word and send this word to the hearer. And then the hearer also knows that word, so this is a successful game. In this case, both the speaker and the hearer will delete all the competing words and keep the used one in that particular game. So a successful game will try to reduce the synonyms among categories in both agents. So similar thing, if you play this kind of a game many, many times, after a while you will find that some neighboring kind of categories will end up using the same color term. So that will trigger the emergence of linguistic category. And then we will let agents to play this game for many, many times and then see what kind of communal language they will develop and how the distribution of focal colors in that kind of a communal language. Let's look at the results. So similarly, we propose several incidence measures to trace the development of communal language, like the successful read, number of linguistic categories, and numbers of synonyms. And you will see that this is the curves tracing different population size results. In each case, we have 110 runs. And you can see that in either case, either under the real color stimuli or random color stimuli, you end up having the same dynamics of the color categorization. So under the same kind of a social cultural transmission setting, you have the same similar dynamics of linguistic color categorization, similar to the category game case. And then to further analyze the emergence of language, we follow some of the measures proposed by Paul Kay and the colleague. It's so-called cross-language dispersion. This is actually the accumulated minimum distance across categories from different languages. Some simple equations, but here we use, instead of Euclidean distance, we use the CIE 94 equations to measure the perceptual distance, which is arguably more realistic. And then we compare the D-real versus D-rand. Here, D-real is actually based on 110 languages emergent under the real color stimuli. D-rand is actually based on 100 sets of languages. Each set contains 110 languages emergent under one set of random stimuli. So you can see that across different number of agents, the D-real is significantly smaller than D-rand, which indicates that color categories emergent under the real stimuli are clustered more closely compared to the random case. It means there could be some universal forces behind those cases. And then in order to compare the focal color distributions, we have to project the color chips from the CIE space, from the CIE LAB space back to the Mansell chips following these equations. And here's the important results. So this is WCS focal color distribution. This is the emergent results under the real color stimuli. This is the emergent results under the randomized color stimuli. So briefly speaking, these two are similar, right? We propose a quantitative measure called the peak-to-peak distance, peak-to-peak distance, to give you a better idea about the similarity between different types of focal color distributions. And you can see that if you compare the real word A and the real stimuli with this WCS, a long time there's a standard drop of this DP2P. Well, if you compare the other cases, there's kind of a fluctuation. And this drop of DP2P, along with the increase in number of communications, actually indicate that via cultural evolution, the distributions of these two sets of focal colors, one is from simulation data, the other is from the word color survey empirical data, become more and more similar. So, which indicates that it is the perceptual constraints of human eyes that trigger the emergence of this linguistic universality. So brief summarize of the results. So we show that under similar social cultural transmission settings, linguistic color categorization actually follow the same dynamics. In particular, under human perceptual constraints, the emergent language actually exhibit a pattern largely resemble the pattern shown in the empirical data. But if you destroy that kind of a perceptual constraints, you end up having a pattern which is quite distinct from the empirical data, and also from this case. This actually indicates that perceptual constraints dominate this linguistic universality. So it induced the universality in linguistic categorization. While social cultural transmission may only play a distinct role of transcribing perceptual constraints into some common linguistic categories with some kind of a slight variation. More importantly, maybe we can claim that the Sapir-Whorfian hypothesis, so language can affect perception, may not hold, at least in the linguistic categorization case. So social cultural transmission can induce variation, but only at the category boundaries, and affect the discrimination of those stimuli due to the competition between perception and linguistic knowledge. But if you talk about focal color distributions, which is more determined by the perceptual constraints. We actually implement unsupervised local learning scenario, which demonstrate the real emergence of linguistic categories from perceptual categories. And it's actually, the model is very simple, and the only parameter of the whole work is actually number of agents. So the local mechanisms of category game is very simple. And it's the displacement of the color stimuli in the CIE-LAB space determines the emergent categorization patterns. There could be some future work in this line. And another important thing in line with Luke's introduction, actually we introduced some new data sets from psychophysics. So if you study linguistic phenomena which concerns human perception, in addition to the simulation data and empirical data, you need to refer to experts, which are psychophysics, which actually demonstrate a multidisciplinary perspective of this kind of research, and point out some new sources of empirical data for linguistic studies, and demonstrate a close connection between language, physiology, and psychology. And the very last slides are benchmark of simulation study. So simulation allows us to directly manipulate some factors which are hard to control in real human experiment, right? And also we can actually provide, simulation can provide results which can be directly compared with empirical data, and point out some new research directions and new empirical studies. So finally, I would like to acknowledge the support and some colleagues, and if you're interested in this kind of work, please refer more details to the recent publication in scientific reports. So, muito obrigado. So thank you very much.